This is the interior of an abandoned house, one located on the outskirts of the southwestern Nigerian city of Ibadan. It's quite clearly a mess, with clothes, buckets, and plastic bags strewn all over the place, and at first glance, the significance of these items might be completely lost on those viewing them. Yet their discovery and the subsequent investigation of the abandoned house caused such widespread horror and outrage that it caused a full-on riot, one in which 20 furious citizens were injured by security personnel charged with preserving the integrity of the investigation. This is the story of the Ibadan House of Horror. A few miles outside of Ibadan lies a sea of greenery, known by locals as the Soka Forest. It is a wild and impoverished area where many of the people simply cannot afford their own motor vehicles. In light of that, a burgeoning motorcycle taxi industry sprang up, where those that could afford a sturdy off-road capable means of transport made money by offering rides to those in need of them. It proved to be a highly competitive industry, yet those who entered it discovered a culture of solidarity among their fellow drivers. Just because they were in competition with one another didn't mean they couldn't take care of one another. So in early 2014, when a number of motorcycle taxi drivers went missing in and around the city of Ibadan, it caused a deep concern among their fellow drivers. A small group of them formed an impromptu search party, and during late March, they began a tireless search of the area in which the drivers had gone missing, that area being the Soka Forest. Eventually, the group came across what appeared to be a large abandoned house. Such structures are commonplace in the area, and many others had been searched without consequence or result. But in this one, the drivers found something soul-crushingly horrifying. Sitting in one of the rooms were several chained-up prisoners, people that were later described as being living skeletons. It's not clear if the missing taxi driver was among them, but as one of the search party rushed to contact the local police force, the rest of the team began to explore the other rooms of the house. It was in these other rooms that they found the possessions of those that had been captured and imprisoned, and the sheer number of items suggested that many more people had been kidnapped during the preceding months. In another room, they found what they could only assume were the remains of these people, as a collection of blood-stained skulls, bones, and decomposing bodies were uncovered. Swarms of fat, gore-engorged flies crawled over almost every surface, with the search party saying that the stench of death was almost unbearable. The survivors claimed that they had been kidnapped by a group of bloodthirsty occultists, people who intended to harvest their body parts before selling them on to affluent Nigerians and politicians who use human flesh for ritualistic purposes. The discovery of the House of Horror and the subsequent media reports generated a huge amount of outrage and controversy all over Nigeria. Then, following a visibly slow response from local law enforcement, some began to claim that the state police had refused to investigate the kidnapping on the orders of high-ranking politicians. These rumors were coupled with the reports that the kidnappers had claimed to be the officials of the Urban Renewal Initiative coordinated by the Oyo state government. As word of such things spread through the surrounding villages, scores of armed and angry locals descended on the house, demanding justice and berating police officers for their perceived inaction. "We want to rescue our people who are still underground and crying for help, but the police are saying no, and we are angry," one rioter was quoted as saying. In response to the outrage, the local governor visited the scene to assure residents that those responsible would be punished. "Those behind this dastardly act will be punished by God," he said, "but we too will punish them when we get them." He'd hoped his words would discourage a full-blown riot, but as the locals entered a feverish state of righteous fury, a heavy amount of violence broke out between police and demonstrators. Around 20 of them were injured in the melee, with police later stating that 6 people, including 5 security guards, allegedly armed with guns, bows, and arrows, were arrested at the scene. In many rural areas of Nigeria, the belief in black magic and ritual still holds a great deal of sway, and many of the less educated turn to the trade of body parts to support their families. Deprivation turns the desperate into murderers as they seek to serve various shamans and herbalists who often convince them that they are subject to magical forces they have no hope of comprehending. In one anonymous interview, a young man who referred to himself only as Shodipe claimed he once worked for a shaman named Adadokun, killing and collecting parts for money and food. Anytime I wanted to go for killing, Baba Adadokun would give me some charms and also teach me some incantations to recite so that nobody would see me at the scene of the crime, he said. I would hit the victim with a shovel and recite the incantation the moment I see blood coming out of the victim's body. Baba instructed me to always move around the victims at the scene after killing them and then turn my back at them for at least 3 minutes, he continued. If I did that, then nobody would see me. Baba said the spirits of the victims would come to him after I had killed them, but did not tell me the reason for the killings. After I carried out his orders, he would buy food for me and give me money. To this day, no one had been held properly responsible for the crimes committed at the House of Horrors. It seems to have just been written off as yet another ritual killing spree in a country where such things happen with depressing and terrifying frequency. Even worse is the fact that larger, bloodier houses of horror had been uncovered all over Nigeria since the one in Ibadan was discovered. One Nigerian newspaper claims that one such house contained literally hundreds of prisoners. 1 or 2 locals suspected of having facilitated the kidnappings had been arrested and charged, but not a single ringleader or buyer has been unmasked, and until then, it seems more than likely than ever more houses of horror are fated to be discovered all over West Africa and beyond. This is a photograph of Fryent Country Park in Kingsbury, northwest London. It covers around 254 acres of rolling fields and small woods, and is home to a number of horses and small fish ponds. All in all, the piece of peaceful parkland makes for an almost idyllic green space in the outskirts of one of the world's oldest and most storied cities. But in June of 2020, that peace was shattered by one of the most hauntingly horrific murders of the year, and when the perpetrator was eventually unmasked, the case would become even more unsettling and disturbing. On the evening of June 5th, 27-year-old freelance photographer Nicole Smallman joined her older sister Biba Henry to celebrate the latter's 46th birthday. Biba was a social worker whose co-workers described as being a passionate advocate for safeguarding vulnerable children and families. And the two sisters just so happened to be the daughters of Mina Smallman, the Church of England's first black female archdeacon. Due to the COVID-19 lockdown regulations imposed by the British government, Biba had to forego a regular birthday party that year. But being the loving sister that Nicole was, she insisted that the pair of them partook in a safe, socially distanced, outdoor celebration in the nearby Fryent Country Park, one that only a handful of their close friends were invited to. CCTV footage captured the sisters making their way to the birthday picnic, and photographs taken by the sisters showed that they stayed in the park after their guests had departed, dancing among battery-powered fairy lights with music being played on a portable speaker. The sisters stayed in touch with loved ones who couldn't make it to the gathering via various instant messaging services, one of whom was Nicole Smallman's boyfriend, Adam Stone. Stone was vicariously enjoying the party through Smallman's picture and video messages, which came at fairly regular intervals. Yet at some point, these messages seemed to drop off altogether. Stone then sent Smallman a series of increasingly concerned texts, begging her to get in touch with him as soon as possible, but no reply ever came. But Stone wasn't the only one who had become frantic with worry, as multiple friends and family members had noticed the abrupt cessation of the sisters' communications. Their concern led them to contact the Metropolitan Police Force in an attempt to report them both missing, yet the police advised them to wait at least another 12 hours before filing a report, as there was a good chance the girls had either lost their phones, ran out of battery life, or were simply sleeping off their hangovers. Adam Stone in particular was deeply dissatisfied with this response, as he knew that not only did Nicole often carry a small portable phone charger in her purse, but wasn't in her character to drink to the point of incapacitation. So, instead of waiting for the police to actually do their jobs, Adam Stone ventured down to the Fryent country park and began to search for his missing girlfriend. It took him almost an hour to cover every spot he suspected as the location of the gathering, but in the end, he spotted something hauntingly familiar at the edge of one particular field. It was the fairy lights the girl had been dancing around in some of their pictures and videos. His heart began to race as he walked towards the fairy lights, and the closer he got, the more the long grass of the field began to reveal a sight he prayed he'd never have to see. It was a blood trail, leading from the site of the gathering to some nearby bushes. Lying among the bushes were the lifeless bodies of Beba Henry and Natalie Smallman. Each had multiple stab wounds, and whoever had murdered them had posed them in a sick parody of embrace in order to defile them in death. Stone later said that the sight had caused him to collapse to his knees in shock and grief before he let out an ear-splitting wail of pain and loss. It was only after the girls' bodies had been found that local law enforcement bothered to do any police work, and while two particular officers scoured the surrounding fields for evidence, they did something that was both deeply controversial and deeply offensive. While on duty, it was discovered that the two officers, 48-year-old Dennis Jaffer and 33-year-old Jamie Lewis, had actually taken selfies next to the sisters' corpses and had smiled as they did so. Not only that, but they had shared the pictures they'd taken in a private WhatsApp group that contained several other active-duty police officers. When the incidents were brought to the public's attention, it caused widespread outrage, and as a result, one of the officers resigned, while the other was forcibly removed from the police force. Just over a year later, when they were eventually sentenced to almost 3 years in prison, Mina Smallman, mother of the murdered sisters, said in a victim impact statement, "It made me think of the lynchings in the deep south of the United States, where you would see smiling faces around a hanging dead body. These police officers felt so safe, so untouchable, that they felt that they could take photographs with our murdered daughters. Those police officers dehumanized our children." Around a month later, a DNA sample taken from one of the women's bodies were determined to be from their killer, and a detailed analysis led police to raid the home of a man with the surname of Hussein. Following the raid on the home in Guy Barnett Grove in southeast London, various electronic devices were seized from the home, but as officers trawled through their hard drives, they discovered that the man's 19-year-old son, Daniel, had been accessing some extremely disturbing online content. According to his internet history, Daniel regularly watched videos that were posted by a Utah-based member of the Satanist Order of Nine Angles. Matthew Lawrence, also known as E.A. Coating, was in the middle of serving a lengthy prison sentence, but somehow still managed to run an online satanic forum, and this forum was frequented by Daniel Hussein, who seemed to have some twisted notions regarding his own nature. Daniel's posts on the forum revealed that he believed himself to be what he referred to as a psychic vampire, and he would often ask other users for advice on forming demonic pacts. Matthew Lawrence had actually replied to one of Daniel's posts at one point, advising him to write out a contract in his own blood and to address the contract to Lucifuge Rofakal, purported to be the true name of Satan himself. If he wrote out such a blood pact using only a burning candle for light, he could bargain for almost anything he wished for, so long as he offered the right sacrifice. Following Daniel's arrest, the same contract was actually recovered by police officers during the search of the Hussein's residence, and this is how they discovered that Daniel had promised to murder one woman a month in return for winning the Mega Million super jackpot of £321 million from a UK-based lottery fund. Police also found lottery tickets and betting slips dated for 10 days after the women were murdered, Each of them had been purchased by Daniel in the hopes that the demon would fulfill their side of the bargain. But despite spending exactly £162 and 88 pence on the tickets, he hadn't won a thing in return. During Daniel's murder trial at London's Old Bailey, it became apparent that Daniel was monitored by British anti-terrorism operatives from around October 2017 to May 2018. He had accessed extreme right-wing web pages from computers at his high school, which in turn fed his searches to British counterterrorism officials. The prosecution commented that why he chose the sisters or what it was about them that caught his attention is also unclear. But once their friends had left, two of them were far more vulnerable, distracted by the fun that they were having, eye-catching because of the lights that they were playing with and now on their own. The court also heard how Daniel had stabbed the women with such force during the attack that his hand had slipped down the knife handle and into the blade. As a result, he suffered a nasty cut to his hand, one which impeded his ability to hold objects, and prosecutors argued that this was the only thing that prevented him from wreaking even more violence on innocent women in the aftermath of his attack on Biba and Nicole. At the conclusion of his trial, Daniel Hussein was found guilty of 2 counts of murder, then sentenced to a minimum term of 35 years in prison, but given his extremely deranged mental state, it is unlikely he will ever be released unless he makes some serious progress in his psychotherapy. The violence he committed, as well as the actions he took in the lead-up to them, are so terrifying and perverse that the evidence has to be seen to be believed, with even hardened prosecutors and judges being sickened when they saw it. There's no doubt that Britain's streets are safer with Daniel Hussein in prison, but whether that's considerably or only marginally so is still up for debate. Yet what's inescapable is that there will be more young men like Daniel, people who eschew the light in favor of a deep and terrible darkness. This is the Kanchanaburi Railroad Bridge, which runs over the Kwai Ye River in Thailand. It is part of a network of railroads collectively known as the Burma Railroad, which stretches for 258 miles across Southeast Asia from central Thailand to southern Burma. And given that the bulk of the construction took place over just 16 months, it's considered one of the most impressive feats of engineering in human history. Yet for the most part, those who took part in the railroad's construction did not do so on a voluntary basis, which is why the Burma Railroad is sometimes referred to by its other name, the Death Railway. On December 8th of 1941, Thailand was invaded by the armed forces of Imperial Japan, who quickly forced the country to surrender. Then, in early 1942, the Japanese attacked Burma, forcing out the British and adding the nation to their ever-expanding empire. But despite the Japanese's rolling success, they were faced with a rather significant logistical dilemma. To supply the troops in Burma, the Japanese mostly depended upon supply ships, which would travel to Burma by circumventing the Malay Peninsula through the Strait of Malacca. However, this route was extremely vulnerable to Allied submarines, so an alternate route was sought. And in the end, Japanese High Command settled on a rather ambitious gambit, the lightning-fast construction of a huge international railroad network. It amounted to nothing short of a civic blitzkrieg. The Japanese began the construction of what they referred to as Taimen Rensetsu Tetsudo in June of 1942, and it was finished ahead of schedule on October 17th of 1943. To quote an American engineer who commented on the railroad as part of a PBS documentary, "What makes this an engineering feat is an accumulation of factors. The total length of miles, the 250,000 people who were involved, the very short time in which it was constructed, and the extreme conditions they accomplished it under. The workers had almost no medication, almost no food, and nothing but for basics like spades and hammers. Plus, they worked in the jungle, in extreme heat and humidity, and that makes this railway an extraordinary accomplishment. As you can imagine, it would take a lot of financial compensation to motivate even the most highly skilled construction workers to build something so huge in such a short space of time. And so, the Japanese used a different kind of worker and used a different kind of motivation. They used prisoners of war under pain of death. Around the same time construction began, 600 British soldiers were forced to build the first of many transit stations to work camps along the railroad. Then, over the months that followed, an increasing number of forced laborers and prisoners of war were transported to the work camps to continue the railroad's construction, and by its peak, almost 250,000 civilians and over 60,000 Allied prisoners of war were forced to work on it at gunpoint. Holding these guns were up to 12,000 Japanese and Korean soldiers who worked as combat engineers, guards, and supervisors of the laborers and prisoners of war. They were renowned for their brutality, neglect, and indifference to the suffering of their workforce, and ensured that workers were kept in the most inhumane of conditions. British prisoner of war Dr. Robert Hardy kept a secret diary during his time as a forced laborer, and one section of his journal notes that the conditions in the civilian camps downriver are terrible. They have no latrines, and special work parties bury about 20 workers a day. These workers had been brought under false pretenses. They were told easy work, good pay, and good houses, but now they find themselves dumped in these charnel houses. They're brutally knocked about by the guards and unable to buy extra food. They're bewildered, sick, frightened, yet many of them have shown extraordinary kindness to sick British prisoners passing down the river, giving them sugar and helping them in the railway trucks. Allied prisoners of war were treated no better by their Japanese guards. They were kept in conditions which were described as horrific, with up to 200 men housed in each tiny shelter, in which they were allowed a 2-foot wide space in which to live and sleep. The Japanese guards were also extremely contemptuous of their prisoners, owing to the fact that there was absolutely no culture of surrender within their own military. To the average Japanese soldier, a warrior who surrendered rather than die in battle was a wretch unfit for humane treatment, and as such, most felt an intense disgust towards the men that they were charged with guarding. As a result of their hatred towards prisoners, the Japanese often refused to provide their prisoners of war with any semblance of luxury or recreation. POWs who were skilled artists, men who yearned to indulge in their creative passions, were often forced to use human hair for brushes, blood for paint, and toilet paper for canvas. Some of these works were even used as evidence at the trials of Japanese war criminals. Throughout the course of the Burma Railroad's construction, a number of despicable war crimes were committed against Allied soldiers and civilian laborers. One example is the carving out of Hellfire Pass in the Tenasserim Hills. The endeavor marked the largest instance of rock cutting on the railway, and is situated in a remote area where the workers lacked proper construction tools during building. On the worksite, guards would throw jagged stones at prisoners working in cuttings below and laugh at the misfortune of their captives. The process exhausted many of the already malnourished workers, causing them to collapse from fatigue, but the Japanese guards were under strict instructions to physically assault any prisoner who collapsed, just in case they were pretending to be exhausted in order to slow down the rock-cutting process. This tactic resulted in no fewer than 69 men, civilians, and soldiers being beaten to death in just 3 months, meaning roughly once a day, one of the workers was kicked and stomped on until pronounced dead by a Japanese medic. Many more died from cholera and dysentery, owing to the lack of medical supplies. One soldier, suffering from a variety of jungle rot which leaves a large rotting batch of skin on the arms or legs, asked a camp doctor what could be done for him. He told me to go down to the latrine, pick up the maggots, then put them on the ulcer to let them do their work, the soldier said. They'll eat all the rotten flesh and you've got a good chance you'll get a clean wound. But then again, given that the maggots had been in contact with human fecal matter, there was just as big a chance that the soldier would contract a serious, fatal infection. Such were the choices that had to be made during the construction of the Death Railway. Perhaps one of the most famous victims of the Japanese cruelty during the construction of the Burma Railroad was a man by the name of Herbert James Edwards. Edwards was taken prisoner following the Japanese conquest of Singapore, and like many others, he was sent to work on the Burma Railway. Just over a year into his captivity, he and 2 other prisoners happened across a supply of food intended for the Japanese soldiers guarding them. Most consisted of canned goods and rice, things they'd be unable to eat without tools or cooking equipment. However, there was one thing that Edwards and his comrades could eat: a live cow. Knowing that the best chance of their continued survival was to kill the cow and eat the raw beef, Edwards and the other 2 prisoners overpowered the beast, brought it down, then killed it with their bare hands. They then set about butchering the cattle by hand, eating their fill, then bringing handfuls of what remained to their fellow prisoners. Just take a second to remember that neither Edwards nor his comrades had any kind of sharp implements whatsoever, as the Japanese kept them almost naked and searched their belongings on a daily basis. Then ask yourself, what exactly did these soldiers use to cut out chunks of flesh? What did they have in their possession that the Japanese couldn't take from them, that would be sharp enough to cut out hunks of meat from the dead cow? Only their nails, and only their teeth. Inevitably, their actions were discovered by the Japanese guards, and after a swift court-martial, the 3 men received their sentence, and the method of punishment preferred by those who ran the construction gangs was as ungodly as it was horrifying: crucifixion. It wasn't strictly a death sentence, simply a form of punishment where his captors didn't care if he survived or not. But before they were actually hung from crosses at the side of the railroad to serve in death as warning to other prisoners, the Japanese guards intended to beat them until death seemed like more of a mercy than a punishment. They were bound at the wrists with fencing wire, suspended from a tree and beaten with a wooden bat until each had multiple broken bones. At one point, when a desperate Edwards managed to free his right hand in preparation for an escape attempt, the Japanese guards drove the sharp end of the wire through the palms of his hands, meaning he'd need to rip his own hands apart in order to escape again. Not long afterwards, 2 Japanese engineers arrived with 3 large crosses, not the kind you might expect to see in a church, but in a large T shape. Then, Herbert Edwards and his 2 heroic comrades were hung by their arms, condemned to die in one of the slowest and most painful ways imaginable. For the next 63 hours, Edwards hung by his bloody, skewered hands, with his comrades sneaking up to feed him meager rations whenever the guards weren't looking. They risked their lives to do so, and miraculously it paid off. Somehow, despite his 2 comrades passing away one night, Edwards survived the ordeal, and after being taken down from the cross, he was nursed back to health by his elated fellow prisoners. They must have been awestruck at his feat of survival, and although I suspect Edwards survived without ripping his hands apart because he had some kind of binding on his arms too, it doesn't take away from the fact that he must have been in a horrifying state by the end of his ordeal. Yet horrifyingly, crucifixion wasn't even the most feared of the Japanese punishments. A soldier named Tom Uren once described how a young Aboriginal soldier was made to kneel on a piece of live bamboo for a number of days as a punishment for some unknown infraction. Bamboos include some of the fastest growing plants in the world, and certain species can grow up to 91 centimeters within a 24-hour period, at a rate of almost 1 millimeter every 90 seconds. It didn't take long before the bamboo was cutting into the soldier's knees, when Uren described how the man's screams of agony built in pitch and intensity until men were forced to cover their ears as a way of preserving their own sanity. Such horrific injuries eventually caused a gangrene infection to break out, and in the end, the soldier had to have both of his legs amputated in order to save his life. An account from Russell Braden, an Australian prisoner of war, proves equally as disturbing. He describes, at one point, while taking part in the construction of a railroad bridge over a section of river, he found a naked man with his legs submerged in the water. When Braden asked why the man was there, he watched as the man simply pointed to his legs. Tiny fish nibbled at the rotten flesh around the edges of his jungle ulcers, and the man explained it was the only way of keeping his wounds clean. The other afflicted men in his labor gang had used up all the available antiseptics and dressings on ulcers that ran the whole length of their shin bones in quote-unquote channels of putrescence. When asked if the process was painful, the man simply nodded, dead eyes and silent as the fish continued to gorge themselves on his putrid, dying flesh. Braden also wrote of a rather wretched Japanese soldier who took care of the funeral pyres, explaining how he would rip the gold teeth from dead men's mouths before tossing them onto the fires. The man would apparently steal food with impunity from other soldiers who dared not touch him out of fear he might contaminate them. He also spoke of one incident where, after tossing what he believed was a corpse into the burning pyre, the body burner gasped as the dead body turned out to still be a living prisoner. The not-so-dead man shot up as he felt the coals scorch his back and thrust a hand out towards the body burner, who was in the process of lighting a cigarette. Quote, with a scream of terror, the man who had burnt hundreds of bodies with callous indifference fell backwards, his hands over his eyes, Braden wrote. Then, when his fellow soldiers reached him, he was jabbering and mad, having gone completely insane from the horror of it all. Occasionally, if a Japanese officer was present, a degree of mercy would be shown to a dying or exhausted prisoner, and they would be swiftly beheaded instead of being beaten or tortured to death. One anonymous Japanese soldier describes how, with an Australian prisoner kneeling before him, a Japanese major gave the condemned man 3 minutes grace in accordance with the law of Bushido. This time was intended to allow the condemned to make peace with the fact that their life was over. When the time came, the prisoner seemed resigned and even stretched his neck out to allow the officer a clean stroke. The major draws his favorite sword, then taps the prisoner's neck slightly with the back of the blade. Then, after raising the sword high above his head, he brings it down with both arms in a powerful sweep. The soldier then wrote of how he heard a hissing sound, possibly the sound of spurting blood from the arteries, before the body fell forward. The soldier describes how the prisoner's severed head was a dead white, like a doll, and how another Japanese soldier rushed over to slice open the prisoner's stomach after flipping the body over, an essential step in the Japanese long-practiced method of ritual execution. By the time the war was over, and the survivors of the Burma Road were returned to Allied hands, some looked like walking skeletons. They appeared as nothing more than a collection of skulls and bones, with taut flesh and thinning hair stretched over them. And although the corporeal wounds may have healed, the mental scarring would last for the rest of their lives. Some men were not only physically but mentally unrecognizable as the people who had left their homes to fight the war so many years before, and many never recovered from their experiences. What happened out in Burma and Thailand are things that not even the most depraved horror movie producers would include in their movies, as most would consider them too far-fetched or too unbelievable to be remotely tasteful. And therein lies the true, soul-shattering horror of the Burma Railroad. It is no fiction. It is very, very real. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. This photograph depicts a section of the forest near the Italian town of Somma Lombardo. Somma Lombardo lies 30 miles northwest of Milan and is a somewhat unremarkable northern Italian town. Yet in the woods outside the unassuming little place, something truly horrifying once took place. One Saturday evening in January of 1988, 19-year-old shop assistant Chiara Marino and her 16-year-old musician boyfriend Fabio Tolles were sharing a few beers in a Somma Lombardo bar named Midnight Pub, which was the center of the city's metal scene. At some point during their evening, they got chatting with a group of metal fans named Andrea Volpe, Nicola Sapone, and Mario Macchione. The group then swapped music recommendations and talked about their favorite records until the bar closed and they were forced to leave. After the throngs of young metalheads spilled into the streets outside, the couple's new friends asked them if they'd like to continue drinking out in the woods that surrounded the town. After hearing how their new friends had brought along a boombox in one of their cars, and how they'd be able to blast metal and drink themselves into a stupor until sunrise, the couple accepted. Then, after piling into the small, rickety vehicle, they drove off into the night, in the direction of the pitch-black forest. Once they were deep in the woods, far from the prying eyes of the devoutly religious local villagers, the group began to engage in a night of pure depravity. As the music blared and the mood became raunchier and raunchier, one member of the group produced a baggie of hard drugs, which were generously shared among the others. Chiara and Fabio were enthralled and intoxicated by how wild and debauched the group was, marveling at how they were not only liberal with their narcotics, but how they were deeply committed to devil worship. They were told that what was occurring wasn't so much a party as a drug-fueled occult ritual enacted in the name of Satan himself. Then, just when the couple least expected it, one of their new friends pulled out a knife, then lunged at a horrified Chiara, slashing and stabbing in a wild frenzy of narcotic-fueled violence. Fabio did everything in his power to defend his terrified girlfriend, but he was quickly overpowered, dragged to the forest floor, and beaten to death with a claw hammer. Chiara tried to run, but it was no good. The group quickly caught up with her, violated her, then subjected her to the same grisly fate as her boyfriend. Once the couple were dead, the trio of Satan worshippers who referred to themselves as the Beasts of Satan dug a shallow, shared grave for the couple, then filled it in as they carried on blaring metal and taking drugs. Once it was filled, the boys began dancing on the grave, willing Satan to resurrect the couple as the living dead. "Now you're both zombies. Try to get out of this hole if you dare," one of them screamed as the others broke into a chorus of sickening laughter. After that, the boys continued drinking and blasting music until the sun finally peeked over the horizon. Then once it did, they drove back home and slept like babies. After Chiara and Fabio's parents reported their children missing, the local police came to the conclusion that the couple had simply eloped to continue their love affair away from the interference of their families. Yet Fabio's father, Mikalsen, refused to accept this explanation, and over the years that followed, he began putting together an intelligence file on the activities of those he suspected were guilty of his son's murder. Officially speaking, the Beasts of Satan's third murder occurred in January of 2004, but between then and 1988, it's suspected but not proven that they were involved in a plethora of other killings. On November 14th of 1996, a 23-year-old construction worker named Christian Frigerio went missing from his home in Brugherio. His disappearance was never solved, but the fact that he was a former member of the self-proclaimed Beasts of Satan gives us a good idea of who might have been responsible for him vanishing. A few years later, a 21-year-old former friend of Andrea Volpe was found hanged in the school he had attended on May 7th of 1999. The police claimed that Andrea Ballerin's death had been them taking their own life, but a number of inconsistencies suggested that the so-called taking of their own life may have been staged. A few months after the hanging, 28-year-old gravedigger Angelo Lombardo was found burned alive in the Legnano cemetery he was employed at. No one was properly held accountable for his death, but he was the second former member of the Beasts of Satan to disappear or die under mysterious circumstances in just a few years. The following year, 26-year-old Doriano Mola was found hanged in the woods near Caveria con Premeso, a town just a few miles away from Somma Lombardo. His death bore all the same strange signs of foul play that Andrea Bellerins had, yet the police simply dismissed the case as nothing more than them tragically taking their own lives. 4 years later, 21-year-old flower seller Luca Colombo was found hanged in Legnano, and it was common knowledge that he was an associate of the Beasts of Satan member Nicola Sapone. The third mysterious death was followed by the horrific murder of 18-year-old carpenter Alberto Scaramuzzino, who was found burned in his car in the woods near Arconate on May 23, 2004. Yet while the police seemed either unwilling or unable to solve any of these deaths, Michele Tolis had observed the strange similarities between them and noted with grim fascination that some seemed to be intimately connected to the group he believed had killed his son. Finally, in January of 2004, 27-year-old shop assistant Mariangela Pezzotta was shot in the throat, mutilated, and later buried alive in the town of Golaseca, a place only a short drive away from Somma Lombardo. When it was discovered she was the ex-girlfriend of Beasts of Satan ringleader Andrea Volpe, he was promptly arrested, and due to suffering from heroin withdrawals in police custody, it was relatively easy to force a confession out of him. Volpe spilled his guts to 2 homicide detectives, explaining how he lured Pezzotta to her death under the guise of a friendly dinner, having already decided her fate due to her knowing too much about Fabio and Chiara's murders. Andrea Volpe then described how after an intense argument, he had shot Pezzotta in the throat before summoning Nicola Sapone to help him dispose of her body. Yet as they were doing so, they discovered that although she was in absolute agony, Pezzotta was actually still alive. Nicola Sapone flew into a rage, berating Volpe while telling him, "You can't even kill a person." Then, after hitting her several times with a heavy spade, the pair attempted to hide the dying girl's body in the greenhouse of one of their girlfriend's parents' homes, burying her alive in the process. After committing such a heinous act of murder, Volpe injected a powerful cocktail of cocaine and heroin, then decided to get rid of Pezzotta's car by driving it into a nearby river. Yet on the way to do so, his state of intoxication caused a car crash, meaning he was an easy target for arrest. Volpe went on to confess to the only murders the police could actually pin on him, the murders of Fabio Tolis and Chiara Marino, and led the police to the spot that he'd helped bury their bodies so many years before. After hearing of Volpe's arrest and confession, Michele Tolis approached the detectives and offered them the intelligence file he had put together from the previous 16 years. This seemed to confirm the existence of the Beasts of Satan and led to the arrest of its third member, Mario Macchione, who presented himself as the psychic medium of the group. Macchione claimed that Fabio was one of his best friends at the time of his death, and that Andrea Volpe had threatened him into taking part in the murder under pain of death. As the investigation continued, it was discovered that the Beasts of Satan had started out as little more than a heavy metal band, but as time went on, they had become less interested in making music and far more interested in satanic ritual murder. This is how it was discovered that the group's drummer, Andrea Bontade, had taken his own life right around the same time they made the transition from music to Satan worship, and it was believed that his former bandmates had either talked him into doing so or staged his murder as a car crash to absolve themselves of any suspicion. At the conclusion of his multiple murder trial on February 22nd of 2005, Andrea Volpe was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Mario Macchione had also confessed to the murders, but was somehow cleared of all charges due to his secondary role in the crimes. The reactions of the victims' families were mixed to say the least. Michele Tolis was quoted as saying, "Today, justice rewarded me." But Lina Marino, mother of the slain Chiara, was outraged at the relatively light sentences that Volpe had received. She told a crowd of gathered journalists, It's not fair. They're murderers. I don't care if they cooperated. They took my daughter away from me, and they should have their own lives taken away. 5 more of the group's associates went to trial in June of 2005, and each were sentenced to long prison terms over the following year. Nicola Sapone was somehow painted as the leader of the group after Andrea Volpe had told police that it was Nicola, not he, that was the mastermind behind the killings. As a result, he received a life sentence, and the 4 other Satanists he went to trial with received between 24 and 26 years for their roles in the 3 confirmed murders. In the aftermath of the group's conviction and sentencing, there was a growing concern in Italy that Satanism and the occult were becoming increasingly attractive to Italian youth. Public outrage was such that, during the bulk of the trials, a Catholic university connected to the Vatican began offering 2-month courses on diabolical possession and exorcism for those who wanted to know more about such a phenomena. One priest by the name of Don Aldo Buonaiuto called for death metal to be banned, claiming that if music makes itself an instrument of nefarious deeds and death, it should be stopped. The Italian police then announced their intention to create a special task force which would focus solely on the occult, particularly Satanists and other violent ritualistic groups. It would coordinate nationwide investigations into potentially dangerous new religious movements and plan to include not only qualified psychologists, but also a priest who claimed to be an expert on the occult. Incredibly, Andrea Volpe was released from prison in 2020 after serving just half of his sentence, and he is currently studying the science of education at an unnamed Italian university. It seems deeply appalling that someone who inflicted such cruelty on people is probably destined to work with children in the future, but the prospect raises profound questions on the nature of redemption and forgiveness. It's entirely possible that Andrea Volpe had completely reformed himself, and that 15 years in prison was enough time for him to strongly reconsider his stance on many of life's deeper questions. But then again, maybe he's just carefully placing himself in a position to commit even worse crimes against those that are even more innocent and defenseless than his original victims. This little fitness-inspired modern art masterpiece is located in Knoxville, Tennessee's Tyson Park. Located near the University of Tennessee's campus in downtown Knoxville, Tyson Park provides a wide array of recreational opportunities and is a popular place to run, walk, or like our skeletal gray friend here suggests, cycle. To many Knoxvillians, Tyson Park is a place of peace and recreation. But back in the mid-90s, that peace was shattered by an event that would forever burn itself into the memories of many of the city's residents as one of the most haunting and chilling murders of the late 20th century. Born on March 10th of 1976, Krista Pike's early years were marred by instability. After dropping out of high school, she sought vocational redemption by joining what was known as the Job Corps, a Clinton-era government program which aimed to aid low-income youth by offering career training and other technical skills. The Job Corps was set up much like any other university, with those enlisted living together in dormitories instead of staying off campus or at home with their parents. Krista began attending the now-closed Job Corps Center in Knoxville, Tennessee, and around the same time, she entered into a relationship with a man by the name of Taddaryl Shipp. It's not clear who was the worst influence on who, but it's clear that throughout the course of their love affair, Krista and Taddaryl became more and more interested in black magic, the occult, and devil worship. Krista also made for an extremely jealous girlfriend and found herself growing violently paranoid every time Taddaryl even talked to another woman. Eventually, Krista's ire became focused on one girl in particular, a 19-year-old by the name of Colleen Slemmer. Colleen had chatted with Taddaryl on a few different occasions, but only in either a professional or platonic capacity. Yet this explanation did little to dampen Krista's fiery jealousy, and at one point, she confronted Colleen and aggressively accused her of trying to steal her man. Colleen flatly dismissed the accusation, insisting that her interests in Tadero were entirely aromantic. But what happened next had been the subject of debate over the years. Some say that Colleen refused to be intimidated by Krista, going about her business as usual and talking to Tadero when she needed to. Yet others purport that Colleen only increased her interactions with him, purely as a means of infuriating an already riled up Krista. Then in the evening of January 12, 1995, Colleen heard a knock at her dorm room door, opening it to see Tadero and Krista standing out in the hallway. They were joined by a friend of Krista's named Shadola Peterson, but instead of seeking confrontation, Krista seemed set on some kind of peace offering. Colleen was told that the whole thing had been a terrible misunderstanding, with Krista admitting that she'd been acting unreasonably jealous and paranoid. To bury the hatchet, Krista and her friends then invited Colleen to Tyson Park to share some marijuana with them. It's reasonable to assume that Colleen was a little skeptical at first, but then again, she trusted Tadero, and if he was present, then there was no way it could have been some kind of ruse. He'd been nice to her in the past and had talked Krista down from straight up attacking her on a number of separate occasions. Surely, if Krista's mood somehow shifted while they were out smoking, he'd protect her again. Properly reassured of Krista's intentions, Colleen agreed, put on her coat, then joined the three friends in signing out of the dorm and walking off into a nearby Tyson Park. As the four teenagers reached a fairly secluded section of the park, Shadola Peterson slowed her pace, then broke off from the group altogether. It's not clear if Colleen even noticed or not, but if she did, it's more than likely she assumed that Shadola had a legitimate reason for doing so. Yet in reality, Shadola was tasked with acting as a lookout, so that Krista could properly indulge herself in a gruesome and unjustified revenge. As Tadero watched and laughed, Krista lunged at Colleen, shoving her to the ground before punching and kicking her in the face. Colleen was so dazed by the sudden ambush that she was almost incapable of defending herself, and as the blows rained down all over her body, her capacity to escape began to dwindle and die. For the next half hour, Krista Pike subjected Colleen to some of the most brutal acts of torture imaginable. She was beaten, stripped, stabbed, mocked, and berated, and at one point, Krista used the knife she was carrying to carve a 5-pointed satanic star into Colleen's chest. When Colleen was bloodied and battered, barely recognizable as she begged her attacker to spare her life, Krista picked up a large, heavy piece of asphalt and slammed it down so hard on Colleen's head that her skull burst open. With Colleen's skull cracked and splintered, Krista kneeled down, picked up a piece of the fractured bone, then slipped it into her pocket to take home as a trophy. One might assume that Krista would be wise enough to hide the evidence of her awful crimes, yet she was so deranged that she did the exact opposite. She spent the following day showing almost everyone at the Jobs Corps that she carried a piece of human skull in her possession, thrilled at the horrified looks her fellow trainees gave her. The same day, Colleen's shattered body was discovered in Tyson Park, and upon learning of her murder, dozens of the people who'd seen Krista's piece of skull rushed to report her to the local police. Within 36 hours, Krista, Tadero, and Shadola had all been arrested, and after a thorough search of their accommodation had been conducted, police officers found a copy of the Satanic Bible in Tadero's room. Shortly after she was arrested, Krista made a full and frank confession, telling a pair of homicide detectives that Colleen's murder was an accident. She claimed that she was only wanting to scare the girl, and that somehow she'd completely lost control of herself during the attack. At her trial, the prosecution asked her if the murder had been some kind of ritualistic satanic sacrifice, something which Krista denied. But the fact that she carved a pentagram into her victim's chest before taking a piece of her skull shocked the judge and jury to the point that following her conviction, the only suitable sentence in their eyes was death. For his part in the murder, Daryl's Ship received a life sentence plus 25 years, while Shadola Peterson, who had provided police with a great deal of information on the murder, received probation in exchange for pleading guilty to being an accessory. For quite a while after Colleen Slemmer's murder, many Knoxvillians deliberately avoided the spot where she was killed, and some who ventured towards the site claimed that they could feel a dark presence in the air around them. The carving of a satanic star in Colleen's chest may well have been a spur-of-the-moment act from the enraged Krista, but many simply didn't buy that theory. To them, Colleen's murder was an act of pure satanic worship, a sacrifice to the devil that had tainted the land around it. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, that's the way the cookie crumbles.